I don't celebrate Halloween. When the trick-or-treaters come out and start prowling my street, I make sure to keep my front porch light off and pull the shades down. If someone rings my doorbell despite all my precautions, I hide in the bedroom and pray they don't ring it again. There's always a fear that maybe it's not a child in a Ninja Turtle mask or wearing a sheet over their head. Maybe, just maybe, it's Granny Clark. Abigail Clark, better known to everyone in Hollisfield as Granny Clark, is the reason I stopped celebrating Halloween. She was the kindest, sweetest old lady in existence. She lived in a little green house at the top of Tamarack Lane that bordered a broad expanse of forest. She had lived there since as long as anyone could remember. Someone once told me she was over 100 years old, and nobody within earshot challenged that claim. I absolutely believed them. Juniper Street, the street that I lived on, just happened to touch that same forest as Granny Clark's. There was a path that wound through the woods, all the way up the hill to her driveway. Many an afternoon was spent in those woods, climbing trees, building forts out of sticks, and running down that winding path from Granny Clark's driveway to the end of Juniper Street, pretending the wolves were biting at my heels. I always felt somewhat unnerved being around Granny Clark. Maybe it was the way she walked all hunched over, her arms bent at the elbows like a Tyrannosaurus. Maybe it was her shock white hair that stuck out in all directions. Or maybe it was the way I could see her blood vessels clear as day through her translucent, liver-spotted skin, and the way her fingers seemed unnaturally long and thin. My mother took me to see her once when I was 7, because they were coordinating together on an arts and crafts table at the local fair. I remember her little green house smelled like lavender and mothballs, and the rooms were lined with photos of children. Some of the photos were black and white or faded, like they had been taken many years ago. "Are these all your kids?" I asked Granny Clark. She smiled and looked around the room.
"These are all my lovely babies."
Afterward, as my mother and I walked down the path to Juniper Street, hand in hand, I told her how amazing I thought it was that one person could have so many children. She just laughed at me.
They aren't really her kids. Miss Clark doesn't have any children of her own. Those were photos of other people's kids.
Well, why does she have photos of other people's kids?
Because their parents gave them to her.
Did you give her my photo?
Not yet.
I looked up at my mother with concern. Please don't. She frowned, but said nothing for the rest of the walk home. 5 years later, I got permission to go trick-or-treating with my friend Spencer on Halloween. Spencer lived over on Rosamond Avenue, which connected with a number of other streets, including Tamarack Lane. The neighborhoods over and around Rosamond were considered the best area for trick-or-treating in town, far superior to the neighborhood down around my neck of the woods. Together, we convinced both of our parents that we were old enough to go out on our own, and that they would just slow us down. What I didn't know at the time was that Spencer had other plans. When my dad dropped me off at his doorstep in my pirate costume, complete with an eye patch, black marker goatee, and a stuffed parrot velcroed to my shoulder, Spencer was already outside, sitting on the front stoop. He was going either as a zombie or an accident victim. I never really asked. His clothes were all torn and covered in stage blood, and he used some sort of wax to create open sores on his arms and face. I was genuinely impressed with the amount of work he had put into making himself look grotesque. Once my father's car rolled out of sight, Spencer grabbed me by the arm and hauled me around the side of his house to the garage.
"Listen, you have to help me pull something off."
"Better not be your pants."
Ha ha. Josh dared me to prank old lady Clark.
Josh Gurry was a kid in our grade who Spencer had a habit of butting heads with. They had had a rivalry ever since they had to wrestle in gym class, and Spencer pinned Josh in under a minute. Since then, Josh was always trying to make Spencer look weak in front of the other kids our age. and Spencer refused to ignore it whenever he did, probably out of a matter of pride. Granny Clark? I didn't like the idea of doing anything to anyone, let alone an elderly person. Spencer saw the concern in my eye.
We're not doing anything serious.
What were you planning? Spencer smiled.
You distract at the front door. I sneak in the back, TP her bedroom.
No way. I'm not going to be an accomplice to breaking and entering.
She always leaves the back door unlocked.
That seemed like a odd thing to know. Spencer explained that he would go in the back, sneak up the stairs, and toilet paper her entire bedroom. As if to prove the legitimacy of his plan, Spencer pulled a large roll of bathroom tissue out of his trick-or-treat bag. What will that prove to Josh? That you can TP some half-blind old lady's house?
Are you in?
We stared at each other through our makeup effects for a couple of minutes before I sighed and gave in. Promise me we'll do a bit of trick-or-treating too. Otherwise my parents will know that we were up to something.
Of course. I want candy too. Jeez.
With that, we set out. Trying not to seem obvious, we meandered around the neighborhood for about a half hour, letting the sun set and waiting for most of the other trick-or-treaters to finish going down Tamarack Lane to reduce the chances of someone spotting us. I got some candy to get started on my alibi, in case I was questioned later as to my involvement in scaring an old lady to death. My stomach was very unhappy with me, and made it known by clenching up like a fist. I was hot in my pirate costume, but my whole body was shaking with anxiety. When the streetlights had turned on, and all the very small goblins and fairies had been carted off back to their homes, Spencer nudged me in the ribs and nodded silently in the direction of the forest. I nodded back, and we made a beeline for Tamarack Lane, trying to make small talk to continue looking inconspicuous. When we got to the end of Tamarack Lane, Spencer threw his arm out, stopping me in my tracks. We both stood, looking at the little green house at the top of the hill. The front porch light was off.
Shit.
Welp, she's in bed. Abort mission. I started to turn when Spencer grabbed my arm.
Wait. Kitchen light. Someone's moving.
There was someone moving around in the kitchen. I couldn't make out who. Just a silhouette pacing around in the back of the house, right near the door Spencer was planning to sneak in through. Spencer reached into his bag, fumbling around for a minute, before pulling something out and shoving it into my chest.
Here, take this.
I took what he handed to me and looked down at it. A walkie-talkie? Are you serious?
Stick it in your candy bag. Ring the bell. If you can't keep her busy, click twice. I'll bail.
Dude, the porch light is off. Spencer looked at me, and I saw desperation in his eyes. He had to prove himself to Josh in this stupid, juvenile, and ridiculous way. And if I didn't help him, he was probably going to do something even dumber. Or worse yet in his mind, go back to school and confess to Josh that he didn't do it. I sighed and dropped the walkie-talkie into my bag. Just go and get it done quick. Granny Clark gives me the creeps. Spencer ducked down low and crept off into the trees and bushes by the side of the road. In an instant, he was out of my sight. Though I heard him shuffling around, snapping twigs, and cursing as he stumbled around in the dark. Once he was gone, I took a deep breath and looked up at the little green house. It seemed bigger suddenly, in a darker shade of green, though I knew it was more my mind playing tricks on me than anything. Through the window, the silhouette of Abigail Granny Clark shuffled around in her kitchen, occasionally disappearing out of sight around the corner, only to shuffle past in the opposite direction a moment later. I ascended the front porch steps, my right hand sliding into the candy bag to feel the walkie-talkie and make sure it was face up for easy access to the emergency button on the front. My pirate makeup was probably running down my face, due to the sudden sweat I had built up on my forehead. The stuffed parrot on my shoulder felt like it was getting heavier. Somewhere deep inside me, a little voice was whispering, "I don't want to be here," over and over again. I felt certain that I was going to hurl at any second. "It's time to nut up or shut up," I whispered to nobody. My finger wouldn't push the doorbell button. It hovered there in front of it for a solid minute, just trembling in fear. Then the walkie-talkie in my bag squawked once, loudly, and I clutched my chest as my heart lurched. Okay. I snarled quietly through gritted teeth at Spencer, who I knew was sending me a signal. I rang the doorbell. The sound of busy work inside the house stopped. I hadn't really been paying attention to the banging and thumping going on inside, but when silence passed over the house, I became horribly aware of the noises that had been going on as I approached. A sliding sound, followed by another thump, and then a louder thump. Should I ring the doorbell again? I thought. Footsteps answered my question. Heavy, slow steps, coming to the front door. The sound of their approach served to fill my tankard of dread even further. There was a hesitation in them, like Granny Clark wasn't sure what to do, or maybe she was waiting to see if I would leave. Please don't make me ring the doorbell again. The porch light came on, and I froze. It was like being cast suddenly in a spotlight. There I was, for all to see. Through the small semicircular window on the door, I caught a brief glimpse of someone looking out to see who had rung the bell. I couldn't make out her eyes, just her eyebrows. Then the door creaked open, and I was face to face with Abigail Clark. She looked haggard. Her eyes were sunken and hidden in shadow. Her features were even more pale than usual, and her whole face seemed to hang off her skull. She had pulled a shawl over her head, hiding most of her shock white hair. I could only see a few strands hanging down in her face. I swallowed the lump burning in my chest. My throat felt so parched suddenly, I could barely squeak out the words, "Trick or treat?" Granny Clark didn't say a word. She just stood there, not moving, staring at me with her dark eyes and that sickly-looking face. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement behind her in the kitchen, and I knew that Spencer had entered the house. I needed to fill the silence, or he would be busted for sure. I coughed loudly, then blinked several times, trying to think of something to say. Miss Clark? I'm sorry if I woke you." Oh shit, I just said we. "My mother insisted I stop by and say hello while I'm out trick-or-treating tonight, and I almost forgot. I knew she would be disappointed if I went home and told her I hadn't paid you a visit. So I was hoping, despite your light being off, you would..." Granny Clark opened the door further, stepping halfway out onto the porch. As she did so, I noted the heavy brown coat she was wearing. I also noticed a pair of thick gloves on her hands. She seemed to straighten and turn, reaching behind the door for what I assumed was a bowl of candy. "Are you having trouble with the heat in your house, Miss Clark?" I could hear myself, and it sounded like I was going to cry. But why wasn't she speaking? One gloved hand beckoned me closer. Her breathing sounded labored and ragged, every exhalation gurgling like a diver using a snorkel. The expression on her face never changed, no sign of joy or excitement, like I had seen every time we visited her in the past. She seemed like an entirely different woman. I felt sensations of discomfort and fear battling each other in my gut. I stepped closer, holding my bag out, when a heavy thump came from the back of the house, followed quickly by the clatter of dishes shattering on the floor. Granny Clark and I both stiffened. Oh shit, I thought. She turned her head in the direction of the kitchen, where Spencer seemed determined to make as much noise as he possibly could. It sounded like he had started having a seizure back there and was flopping around on the kitchen tiles, slapping everything in sight. Panic lurched out of the pit of my stomach. It felt like my eyes were going to bulge out of their sockets as I tried to think of anything to say to save the situation. My mind blanked, with just the word "go" flashing like a neon sign in the center of my brain. Without another word, I turned away to make a hasty retreat. Granny Clark's heavily gloved hand clamped down around my wrist. For being 100 years old, so they said, she had a grip like a lumberjack. She squeezed so tight, my legs turned to instant jello. Dropping me to my knees, my goodie bag hit the ground with a loud clatter as I grabbed at her hand, crying out in pain. "Miss Clark, you're hurting me." The other hand behind the door appeared, not holding a bowl, but a large box cutter. She extended the blade, looking at me with the same emotionless expression, and pulling me closer to her. The whole moment was so surreal. I just knelt there on the porch as she dragged me toward her, trying to understand what was happening. Why was she holding the box cutter? Where was the candy? What's going on? It was Spencer who saved me. His voice echoed, one screaming distantly from the kitchen, while almost at the same time crackling over the airwaves and coming out of the bag at my feet.
Run!
Granny Clark turned again in the direction of the kitchen as she caught sight of Spencer dashing past, throwing open the back door and disappearing into the backyard. In doing so, her grip loosened on my wrist ever so slightly, just enough for me to twist my arm and squeeze through her fingers. She turned back to me, grabbing for me with her free hand, while the one holding the box cutter arched back threateningly. Even then, laying there on the porch, watching the kindest old woman in town come at me, the blade of the box cutter glinting from the streetlights, I tried to rationalize the situation. This wasn't the Granny Clark I knew. I looked up at her, sobbing in panic, and trying to find words to calm her. I scrambled back a foot. "Please, it was just a joke. I'm sorry." The left half of Granny Clark's face seemed to sag, like it was melting. Her eye looked funny and droopy. The guttural breathing suddenly sounded like a snarl, feral and angry. She brought the blade down, and I instinctively raised my hands to protect myself, screaming in pain as I felt the edge slice through the fabric of my costume and open the flesh of my arm. I didn't give her a second chance. My legs, which had surrendered to gravity, felt an intense burning of adrenaline pumping through them. Tucking into myself, I rolled backward, trying to gain my footing, but ended up tumbling down the porch steps instead, white-hot pain shooting up my left side. And I screamed again, but I refused to pause. I was too driven by blind panic. I got to my feet in a hurry as the old woman on the porch straightened up, towering over me like a giant. She tromped toward the steps with a frightening determination. Spencer came around the corner of the house at full tilt, eyes wide with terror. He surveyed the scenario unfolding on the front porch, and a look of confusion washed over him for a second before he grabbed me by the arm and spun me around.
"Make for the woods!"
And with that, he was off like a shot, sprinting to the end of the driveway where the forest started. I ran hot on his heels, my arm and my head both throbbing. Dizziness and nausea swept over me, and I tripped over my feet, colliding with the side of Granny Clark's car and pausing for the briefest of moments to vomit down the side of it. How had everything gone so wrong? Before I could collect my thoughts, I heard the heavy thud of boots, and looking back, I saw Granny Clark's hulking form lurching toward me, silhouetted by the street lamps in her heavy coat, with the shawl over her head. She looked massive, like a lumbering horror, hell-bent on my destruction. Nobody's going to believe this. Even I don't believe it, and I'm seeing it, I thought. I shook it off and bolted for the tree line. I knew if I could just make it to Juniper Street, I would be safe. The trail was a windy quarter-mile, but it was all downhill, and I had enough terror-based energy pumping through my veins to keep me going. I had run that path for years, and I knew every gnawed root that might trip me up, every change in the angle of the descent, every curve to avoid a tree in the dark. Just get home. The moon was out. It was filtering through the branches, making beams in the dust kicked up by Spencer before me. It highlighted the path and cast the forest in a creepy blue hue. Everything around me seemed to glow. If I hadn't been running for my life, I might have stopped to take it in. The adrenaline coursing through me made time seem like it was slowing down. Every footfall felt like I was slogging through thick mud. I have never been as perfectly attuned to my senses as I was sprinting through the forest that Halloween. I could hear everything around me, my breath coming out slow and focused, my heart thumping in my ears, the snapping of branches further down the path as Spencer, less familiar with the way, ran ahead, and the heavy clumping of someone coming down the trail behind me. I turned to look. I did it, knowing all the stories of people being told not to look back, and all the bad things that happened to them when they did. I did it, not wanting to really see what it was, because I knew. I did it, and all my hopes of making it home disappeared in a flurry of wings, like a flock of startled pigeons. Granny Clark was right behind me, thundering down the trail like a rampaging elephant. She was a good 20 paces back, but I could see her perfectly in the sliver of moonlight we both ran through. The most frightening thing about her was the look on her face. It wasn't one of anger or even determination. In fact, there was no expression whatsoever. Her eyes were dead. Her mouth seemed to hang open, the left half of her face still slogged down like melting candle wax. And then the wind whipped her shawl off, and her face with it. It just slid off as easily as a Halloween mask, disappearing somewhere on the trail behind her as she closed in on me, as determined and frightening as ever. Where her face had been, there was just blood everywhere. But I could finally see her eyes through it all. They were looking at me with a terrible rage and madness I had never seen before. I thought I was going insane. She bore down on me, the sight of her hate-filled, bloody face burning forever into my mind. Her hands reached out, trying to grab me and guide me to hell. But all I could focus on was that scarlet face, the true fury within her, finally revealed. There was a sharp turn in the path. I slowed for only a fraction of a second to make it. Granny Clark was not as familiar with the trail, her momentum driving her straight on. Her fingers licked past the back of my head and wrapped around the stuffed parrot on my shoulder. She tore it off as she barreled headlong into the trees behind me, crashing to a stop with violent abruptness and then silence. She can have the parrot, I thought. When I burst out of the woods and onto the tarmac of Juniper Street, I was moving like all of hell was on my heels. Ahead, I saw Spencer slowly trying to catch his breath as he reached the driveway to my house. Somewhere along the way, he had lost his own trick-or-treat bag, and most of his makeup had run off. "Don't stop!" I yelled at him. He turned, seeing me hurtling down the road, and hurried up to the front door, banging on it and shouting. I dashed up the front sidewalk, shoving him aside and throwing my shoulder into the door, having enough sense to just turn the knob and open it. We fell over each other in the landing, and Spencer kicked futilely, trying to close the door behind him. I climbed over him and slammed it shut, then deadbolted it and leaned my full weight against it and broke down into tears while clutching my arm.
Jesus Christ.
We both started shouting over each other, neither one listening to the other, until my mom and dad, hearing the commotion, ran in from the living room to find us yelling and bloody. They looked us over with mild annoyance until my mom saw my shirt soaked red with blood and her eyes bugged out.
What the hell happened?
I sobbed, my mind retraced through everything that I had just witnessed. They took her face. It came right off. Both my parents looked equal parts concerned and nonplussed. I could tell they thought we had just spooked ourselves and had gotten hurt running away. I waved my hand at Spencer to silence him, and then told them everything. As my story unfolded, their expressions vacillated between doubt, anger, and concern. Honestly telling them that Granny Clark attacked me with a knife and then chased me through the woods before her face peeled off, I had a hard time believing it myself. When I finished, Spencer told his side.
When I went through the back door, I could see Will and what I thought was Granny Clark at the front door. I tried to creep around to the stairs, but I tripped over a pair of legs. Miss Clark's legs. She was lying in the food pantry.
I had never seen Spencer cry before, but his eyes welled up with tears. As he continued,
her face was missing. I could see all the stuff underneath. They had pulled it all right off, just like peeling an orange. Jesus, Mary and Joseph, they took her face.
My mom disappeared into the kitchen, where I could hear her using the phone to call the police. My father stood there, shaking his head in disbelief at us. Spencer and I locked eyes.
I realized it wasn't her on the porch, and I told you to run. I'm so sorry.
I hugged him, forgetting the pain on my arm for a moment, as he balled his fists up in my shirt and buried his face in my chest, adding his tears to the blood and sweat I was thoroughly soaked in. When the police got to Abigail Clark's house, they found her just as Spencer had described. Her throat had been slit, and all the flesh on her face had been removed. They also found that whoever had murdered her had torn up the carpeting in her living room and started pulling up the floorboards, apparently looking for something. They suspected that the killer had heard a rumor that the old lady had a fortune hidden in the walls or the floor of her house. We had all heard that rumor before, but nobody in town actually believed it. In the woods, they found the remains of her face, cut from ear to ear, worn like a mask. They also found my stuffed parrot lying in the leaves by a blood-covered tree at the turn that had saved me. One of the branches on the tree was snapped and dripping with the stuff. Even more blood was found where the path opened out onto Juniper Street, and after that, the trail went cold. They found the killer a day later, an unemployed carpenter who lived 2 towns over with a history of violence. He checked into the hospital with a gouged out eye, claiming he had accidentally impaled himself while hanging a picture. Apparently his blood work came back with 2 different types on him, one of which was identified as belonging to Abigail Clark. Thankfully, he confessed, saving the police from having to ask Spencer and I if we could identify him. Neither of us would have been able to, and neither of us wanted to ever see him again. But I still do see him though, regularly. Whenever the scar on my arm flares up, and my dreams become of running down that moonlit trail in the woods with him just 10 steps behind me. Of course, the face I see isn't his. It's always Granny Clark's face, devoid of emotion, yet every step filled with that angry determination of catching me and putting me in the ground. Granny Clark, the most beloved person Hollisfield has ever known, is the monster that haunts my worst nightmares.
So, I feel a little silly posting this, but I've been at my wit's end lately, and I feel I need to tell someone. For context, I'm a 58-year-old woman from North Carolina. 2 weeks ago, my husband, we'll call him Don, disappeared while working in the Pisgah National Forest. He's a senior wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He was tracking a family of red wolves when he failed to radio in for the evening, and a search was promptly called. They searched for over a week, and I was told to prepare for the worst. But then, on the 10th day, he was found, at a truck stop in Brevard, no less. He'd wandered right out of the tree line, apparently, and I guess people must have seen the state of him or whatever because they'd called for an ambulance right after. Naturally, I was overcome with relief when I got the call and promptly headed over to Mission Hospital in Asheville, finding my husband bedraggled and confused, but very much alive, still clad in the survival blanket the paramedics had wrapped him in when they'd found him. He'd lost 20 pounds and was suffering from severe hypothermia, to the point where nobody on staff could explain how he was still alive. By all accounts, he should have been dead. Furthermore, it was clear that at some point he'd also taken a fall, his body peppered with fine scratches and scuffs, though he couldn't remember anything. In fact, not what happened, nor where he'd been for the better part of 2 weeks. The doctors kept him under observation for the next few days before, finally, we were allowed to go home. Which brings me to the reason for this post. So, a little bit about Don. He's a complainer. Even from way back when we first started dating, over 40 years ago now, if you can believe it. The man has complained about everything. The heat, the cold, if somebody's running late, if it's raining. Not in a mean way, of course, and always subtle. A grumble here, side-eye there. Sometimes we'd be out to dinner and I'd catch him gazing down at his food, and we'd share a look, and even though he wouldn't say anything, I'd know he was annoyed about something. He's what my Grammy would have referred to as a sourpuss. Anyway, I bring this up because ever since we got back, he hasn't complained a single time. I know that might seem like a small thing to you, but given how much of a prolific whiner he usually is, to say this is out of character for Don is an understatement. Mostly now, he just sits in front of the TV, watching rerun after rerun of old sitcoms and TV shows, something he previously would have abhorred doing, figuring the act akin to watching paint dry. Then, of course, there's the other thing. I spoke to his psychiatrist yesterday, Dr. Weiss. Nice lady. She said it's not unusual for people to experience memory loss following a traumatic experience and that his memory would likely return in time. And while I can understand this, doesn't account for the fact that I get the feeling Don is lying to me, though I cannot, for the life of me, think why this would be. I know my husband. Ask any long-married wife, a woman's intuition is never wrong. Why on earth he would lie about something like that, though? I have no idea. I mean, I get he's embarrassed, but still, I'm his wife, for Christ's sake. I tried talking to him about it, but he's adamant he doesn't remember a thing. I want to press him further, but not sure if I should. For instance, I read an article only this morning in Psychology Today, which suggested that memory loss after a traumatic event might in fact be linked to the brain's natural inclination to wanting to protect itself. I don't know what to do. I feel like ever since he's got back, he's like a completely different person. I suppose that's to be expected given what he's been through and all, but still, am I crazy? Anyway, any advice on this matter would be greatly appreciated. Thanks in advance. B. Update number 1. Okay, so before I begin, I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who replied to my last post. It's so nice to know I'm not losing my mind. Also, to the woman who said I was being insensitive posting about my husband's ordeal, kindly blow it out your ass. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I have updates. First and foremost, we got the last of Don's blood work back from the hospital on Tuesday, and aside from his white blood cell count being a little low, as expected, I'm pleased to announce everything appears normal. So, no infection, no lingering effects, at least not physically. For example, I was just getting back from the grocery store yesterday morning when I'd returned to find Don not in the house. There'd been a moment's blind panic before I eventually found him out back, standing by the tree line that marks the edge of our property. Our yard backs into Pisgah National Forest, which was actually one of the reasons why we had bought it in the first place. He'd just been standing there in the rain, staring over at the tree line, totally still. I'd had to call him a good half a dozen times before he finally snapped out of it. I felt terrible, of course. I was on observation duty after all. And what with Don being a fully grown man, I just assumed he could be left for 30 minutes without riddling himself with yet another bout of hypothermia. Apparently not. When I asked him what he was doing, he'd just mumbled something about getting some fresh air, and then gone and sat back on the couch like nothing had happened. I mentioned this to Dr. Weiss later, who seemed concerned but not alarmed, and again assured me that everything was fine. Another thing. He's been getting up in the night, something that's especially strange, as not once in all the years of our marriage can I recall him ever having sleepwalked before. And if he'd done so as a kid, his mother had never mentioned it, something she absolutely would have, God rest her soul. I have no idea what to make of all this. A part of me wants to put his behavior down to head trauma, but we'd had a CT scan done back at the hospital and everything came back clear, so it can't be that. I know I'm probably coming off like a complete hypochondriac here. I'm sure I'm just overthinking everything. Anyway, that's all for now. We'll update again once I get the chance. Thanks again. B. Update number 2. I don't know how to start this post, so I'm just going to come right out and say it. Something is wrong with my husband. I followed him last night, one of Don's great sleepwalking adventures. I'd gotten up to go to the bathroom and was just heading back to bed when I'd noticed Don's bedroom door standing ajar. We sleep in separate rooms on account of Don's sleep apnea. I found him stood in the kitchen by the sink, once more with his back to me. For the longest moment, I thought he had to be looking out the window at something. A raccoon, perhaps. But then I'd caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window and realized what he'd actually been doing, which was Don had been talking to himself. Only, that's not quite right. His mouth had been moving, yes, but no sound had come out. It reminded me a little of those ventriloquist dolls. The blank, glassy eyes, the forceful way his jaw slapped shut after each mimed word. And as I'd stood there watching from the hallway, a peculiar idea had struck me. Practicing, I'd thought. He's practicing. Why that thought exactly, or what it meant, I have no idea. All I can say is that standing there in the dark, for whatever reason, it had felt correct. This morning, I dragged him over to Dr. Weiss's office. I'd confronted Don about his behavior over breakfast, only of course he didn't recall a thing. Had seemed genuinely taken aback when I'd informed him about his little midnight escapade. I didn't tell him about the kitchen part, though. All other things aside, I had spent the remainder of that night trying not to think about it, and had no specific urge to relive it again. And besides, it would only have upset him. Dr. Weiss tried to play it off as a simple case of sleepwalking, of course, or somnambulism, as she called it. Again, not uncommon following incidents of significant distress. I'm not sure whether she believes this or if she's simply trying to ease my mind. It's 11:58 p.m. now, and things have been getting worse. I can hear Don moving around out in the hall as I write this, grunting and rutting up against my door like some kind of wild animal. I have absolutely no idea what to do. I considered briefly calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I'm afraid my husband isn't my husband anymore? If someone else has experienced anything similar, or if you have some idea of what is going on with Don, please let me know. I am seriously worried. We'll update as soon as I can. B. Update number 3. Okay, first things first, I think I may owe all of you an apology. Skimming back over my last post, it's clear I may have exaggerated a little in my distress. So remember that whole sleepwalking thing? I spoke to Don's sister yesterday, and turns out there is in fact a history of sleepwalking on his side of the family. So I guess that explains all the midnight walkabouts. Also, Dawn and I talked. Turns out the hospital had him on some kind of crazy anti-anxiety sleep aid, and one of the side effects is acute parasomnia. Things like sleepwalking, sleep talking, acting out, dreams, and so on. I googled it, and sure enough, it's right there in black and white. I feel so silly. I showed him these posts and he laughed. Called me a daft old bird. Ain't that the truth? So yeah, he's fine. We're fine. I don't know what I was thinking. Anyway, thanks for all your comments and for putting up with my worrywart routine. You gals are awesome. B. Update number 4. I don't know where to begin. So much has happened since I last posted, and I'm still struggling to make sense of it all. I got a call from Mr. Hanley, Dawn's boss, yesterday evening. Dawn's dead. They found his body in the woods about 40 miles from the sector he'd been working in when he'd gone missing. He'd stumbled into a ravine near Laurel Gap and broken his leg, and exposure had done the rest. He'd been entirely naked when they'd found him. What they'd initially taken for a paradoxical undressing before quickly dismissing the idea due to an evident lack of any nearby clothing. Initial talk is that he'd been dead for some time, which, if you've been following these posts, you've probably got questions. If Dawn's been dead this whole time, who's been living in my house? I can't explain it. Not sure I'd want to even if I could. I found Dawn in the bathroom last night. He was hunched over the sink, shaking and moaning, his naked body covered in a sheen of sweat. I could hear what sounded like bones cracking as his body twitched and contorted. Of course I say his body. Even with his back to me, I noted the familiar wideness of his hips, the thin lengths of gray-blonde hair hanging down his back. I caught a glimpse of his face in the mirror's reflection. The face it was wearing was mine. I had barely time to scream before the Dawn thing turned on its haunches and in a single movement threw itself through the bathroom window. I raced over to the ledge, catching one fleeting glance before it passed into the tree line, huffing and keening. And right before it disappeared, I swear I saw its outline shift. Into what? I can't say. I don't know what to believe anymore. I've spoken to my sister in Spokane, and I'm going to go stay with her and her husband while I prepare Dawn's funeral. This will be my final post. Just now, as I was finishing this, I heard a laugh from the tree line. It sounded like mine.
I used to own a small Halloween-themed shop. It was located downtown in a fairly small city. And unlike many businesses in town after Walmart's arrival, my store never really suffered when it came to customers. Of course, it was only open for the month of October. I sold a lot of unique things you might find at any other novelty stores in the bigger cities, but for cheaper prices. I didn't really do it for profit as much as I did to celebrate the Halloween spirit. I also love to celebrate that spirit by doing my best to scare the crap out of people every Halloween. One particular Halloween, my chosen victim was my buddy Alex. He was a pretty relaxed and calm guy for most of the time. He was also the perfect person for the plan I had in mind. First, you should know that I always began packing up my store every Halloween fairly early in the morning, as it was unlikely to get customers on the holiday itself. I told Alex that I had much heavier merchandise that year, and I could use his help moving it all out. Not knowing what he was getting into, he accepted, and I told him to meet me at the shop at 10 at night, sharp. As I said, Alex was a relaxed and calm guy most of the time. Unfortunately for him, he had this irrational fear of clowns, and he couldn't function around them. So naturally my plan involved dressing up in a clown costume. When he arrived at the shop, I would stand perfectly still like a statue. Once he realized that he couldn't find me, he would then call me, most likely. But when my phone rang, it would be in the pocket of the clown costume, and when he came over to investigate, I would give him my best scare. Pretty simple plan, right? Everything was set in motion. I dressed up, stood near the back of the store obscured by some boxes and other decorations, and waited for his arrival. Just after 10, Alex entered. It was very dark in the store, as I had made the last-minute decision to cut the lights before he arrived. He called my name a few times, but of course, I didn't respond. I heard him walking around a bit, looking around the shop for me. I could barely hold back my laughter. After a bit more shuffling, I heard Alex speak in a defensive tone. "Not funny, dude." I looked around, but there was definitely no way he could see me right then, even if I had accidentally moved or something. I continued to play dumb. "Come on, man," he repeated again, sounding angrier this time. "This isn't funny." Confused, I quietly adjusted a nearby stack of boxes so I could peer through a crack toward his voice. I couldn't make out his shape very well, but I knew for sure he wasn't looking in my direction. Suddenly, my phone rang. I heard Alex turn toward the sound instantly. I froze, giddy with excitement that the plan might be working. But as he approached, I realized he wasn't holding his phone, and a wave of disappointment fell over me as I discovered my prank had been ruined by another caller. "All right, fine, you got me," I announced shortly after the phone stopped ringing, taking off my mask and stepping out into the open. But Alex's face didn't look relieved. His face twisted in such horror that I had never seen before. He began yelling and spouting words in panic, and I spent a few minutes trying to calm him down. He explained to me that when he entered the store, a man in a clown costume had stared at him and began walking slowly toward him. But when my phone rang, the man had dashed right out of the store. Alex had no idea I was actually hiding in the back the entire time. I don't want to think about what would have happened if Alex had showed up late that night, or if I hadn't received that other phone call during the prank. Hey guys, it's Uncle Unit. I hope you enjoyed this year's Halloween special. Before we wrap things up, I want to extend a shout out to Vidith22, Ali James, and Jose Kage. Big thank you to those guys for helping me out with these stories. I've linked their YouTube channels and social media in the description. Be sure to check them out when you get a chance. I know on my community tab I promised you guys 2 Halloween specials, but that's absolutely still the case, and the second half of the Halloween special will be linked at the very end. It's something a little different from my usual content, and I was going to post it here, but I figured it would be a better fit on my second channel. I need more content there anyways. Welp, I hope you guys have a great night, and happy Halloween. Check for the razors and the candy and all that good jazz. And of course, as always, never forget.
Fuck this cowboy shit! You fucking ho-dunk, po-dunk, well then there, motherfuckers! There's always a reason to be afraid.